What would you do if a stranger blocked you from entering your own home? Marcus, a black man, faces this shocking reality when a white woman stops him at his doorstep, sparking a confrontation that will change everything. When Marcus returns home, he is stopped by a white woman, Mrs. Harris, who insists he doesn't belong there. She refuses to let him enter, despite him showing her that he is the rightful owner. But why would someone block a man from his own home? What happens next will leave you speechless. As the confrontation escalates, Marcus finds himself not only fighting for his rights but for justice. Will he stand strong or be defeated in his own home? The shocking consequences of this encounter will change everything. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story, if you haven't subscribed to our channel, Epic Story Moments, yet, now is the perfect time. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and be the first to hear our incredible new stories. Don't forget to like, share, and comment to support more heartwarming tales like this. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. The suburban neighborhood where Marcus lived was one of those typical American streets, lined with neat houses, well-maintained lawns, and quiet roads. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other, and the community prided itself on its peace and tranquility. After a long day at work, Marcus, a black man in his early 30s, was looking forward to returning to his sanctuary, his home. The weight of the day had left him tired, but the thought of his peaceful home brought him a sense of relief. He'd worked hard to get where he was, and this house was a symbol of that hard work, a symbol of progress. As Marcus walked down the familiar sidewalk, the sounds of children playing and the soft hum of a distant lawnmower filled the air. It felt like just another evening. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood. He could see his house in the distance, a charming, modest two-story home that he had purchased with his own savings. It was his pride and joy, the place where he had worked tirelessly to build a life for himself. But as he neared the front door, something felt off. A figure stood by the entrance, blocking the way. It was Mrs. Harris, an elderly white woman who lived a few houses down. Marcus had seen her around often, always watching, always seemingly aware of what was happening in the neighborhood. She had never been unfriendly, but he always felt a certain coolness from her. Tonight, however, her demeanor was different. Mrs. Harris stood near the porch, her arms crossed over her chest, her face scrunched up in a look of disapproval. As Marcus approached, she stepped forward, planting herself firmly in his path. He slowed down, confused, wondering what could have caused such an odd behavior. "You can't go in there," she said firmly, her voice sharp and insistent. Marcus blinked, certain that he had heard her wrong. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice a mix of surprise and confusion. "You don't belong here," she said, pointing to the door behind him. "This is private property." At first, Marcus was taken aback, unsure of what was happening. It was his house, his home. His keys were in his pocket, ready to unlock the door, and yet this woman, who was supposed to be a neighbor, was blocking him from entering. "What are you talking about?" Marcus asked, his voice steady but now tinged with the faintest edge of frustration. "I live here. This is my home." But Mrs. Harris was unrelenting. Her eyes narrowed, and she shook her head as though Marcus were speaking a foreign language. "No, you don't," she said, almost as if she were speaking to a child. "I know everyone around here. You don't belong here. I've never seen you before." A chill ran down Marcus's spine as he stood there, unsure of what to do. He had lived here for nearly 3 years. He knew all the neighbors by sight, if not by name, and he had never had any trouble. There was no doubt in his mind that this was his home. He had purchased it himself with the money he earned from his job, his hard-earned money. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his keys. He held them out in front of Mrs. Harris, a gesture meant to show her that he had every right to be here. "These are my keys," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This is my home. I live here. You can check my ID if you'd like." Mrs. Harris glanced at the keys, then at Marcus, and something in her expression shifted. But she wasn't ready to back down. Instead, she stepped closer, blocking him further. "I don't need to check anything. I'm sure you've stolen those," she muttered, her voice low but cutting. The word stung. Marcus felt his face flush with anger, but he tried to stay composed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was clear that Mrs. Harris wasn't simply questioning his right to be there. She was challenging his presence altogether, as though he had no place in the neighborhood. "I don't know what your problem is, but I'm going inside my house," Marcus said, his hand now on the doorknob. But Mrs. Harris wasn't backing down. She raised her hand as if to physically stop him. "I'm not letting you in," she said, her voice shaking with an intensity Marcus hadn't expected. In that moment, a wave of disbelief washed over him. How could this be happening? How could someone so resolute in their belief that he didn't belong here be standing in his way, preventing him from entering the place he called home? The shock of the situation made it hard for Marcus to process. He couldn't understand why Mrs. Harris, of all people, would act like this. Was this just a simple misunderstanding, or was there something more at play here? As he stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, he noticed something that made his heart sink. The few neighbors who were peering out of their windows were watching with the same disinterested expressions they always wore. No one was stepping forward to help him. In fact, the silence of the community was deafening. Was this the kind of place where people would simply watch and do nothing when someone was being wronged? Marcus felt a lump form in his throat, not just from the hurt of the situation, but from the overwhelming realization that this wasn't just about one person blocking him from his home. This was about something much bigger, something he had faced before, but had never been so starkly confronted with. And at that moment, he knew this wasn't going to be a simple disagreement. It was a battle for something much more important than just a house. It was a fight for his dignity, his rights, and his place in a community that, on the surface, had always seemed welcoming, but now was revealing its true colors. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing to understand what was happening. This couldn't be real. He had lived in this neighborhood for years, and yet here he was, standing at his own front door, being denied entry by a woman who barely knew him. The confusion was overwhelming, and for a brief second, he felt as though he had stepped into a nightmare where his rights, his place in this community, meant nothing. He cleared his throat and tried to steady his voice. "I don't know what's going on here, but this is my house. I own it," he said, holding his keys up in front of her, as if the simple act of showing them would make everything clear. "I'm the homeowner, and I have every right to be here." Mrs. Harris didn't budge. She tilted her head slightly, a look of disdain on her face, as though she were examining him like a specimen she couldn't quite place. "I don't believe you," she said with a sharp tone, narrowing her eyes. "You don't belong here. Someone else should be coming home to this house. Not you." Marcus blinked, stunned by the audacity of her words. "What do you mean, someone else? I live here. I bought this house with my own money. I've been living here for years," he said, trying to make her understand. But Mrs. Harris didn't seem interested in listening. Her posture was rigid, arms crossed, standing in front of the door as though she was the one with authority over who could enter. A wave of frustration surged through Marcus. He had never encountered anything like this before, not in his own home, not in his own community. But he wasn't going to back down. He was a man of reason, and he knew he had to remain calm if he was going to resolve this peacefully. "I'm going to show you my ID, Mrs. Harris," Marcus said, pulling out his wallet and holding up his driver's license. "This proves I live here. It's my name on the deed, my name on the bills. Everything. You have to let me in." She glanced at the ID, but her eyes flicked back to him with an unsettling coldness. "That could be fake," she muttered, dismissively waving her hand as though it didn't matter. "I've lived here for years, and I've never seen you before. You don't fit in." Marcus was speechless for a moment, his mind struggling to process her words. "What do you mean I don't fit in? I live here. This is my home," he repeated, each word growing firmer, more desperate. Her gaze never wavered. "I'm just looking out for the neighborhood," she said, her voice low but insistent. "I've seen strange faces before. You're not who you say you are." There was an underlying implication in her words, something Marcus couldn't ignore, the subtle suggestion that he, as a black man, didn't belong here, and that thought sent a chill through him. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped forward, trying to stay calm. "Mrs. Harris, I understand you might be concerned, but this is my home. I've never caused trouble in this neighborhood. I've always paid my taxes, followed the rules, and been a good neighbor." But she stepped even closer, blocking him again. "I'm just protecting this community," she snapped, her tone sharp and final. "People like you shouldn't be living here." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. He wanted to shout, to argue, but instead, he held his ground. He knew this wasn't just about the house. It was about something much bigger, something deeply rooted in the way she viewed him, in the way she saw his presence in this neighborhood. It was about race, and it was a reality he had been aware of for his entire life, but had never experienced so directly in such an intimate way. As he stood there, trying to gather his thoughts, the situation began to escalate. He could feel his heart racing, a mix of anger and helplessness swirling inside him. This wasn't just an isolated incident anymore. He was being publicly questioned, scrutinized, and judged in a way that was completely unfair. Marcus's frustration began to boil over. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising with the pressure of the moment. "This is my house. You have no right to stop me." The sound of more footsteps drew his attention, and he saw a few of his neighbors gathering near their windows, watching the confrontation unfold. Some of them seemed to have their arms crossed as well, eyes wide, some staring curiously, others perhaps uncertain of what was going on. Not one person came out to speak up. Not one person came to defend him. The man who was standing on his own property, fighting for his right to simply exist there without being questioned. This moment of silence from the community was deafening. The lack of support hit Marcus harder than anything Mrs. Harris had said to him. He could feel his voice shaking with the weight of it all. He was fighting against not just Mrs. Harris, but the deep-rooted biases that had been allowed to fester for so long in this seemingly peaceful neighborhood. "Why is no one saying anything?" Marcus said, more to the gathering crowd of silent onlookers than to Mrs. Harris. "Why aren't any of you helping me?" Mrs. Harris, however, wasn't fazed by the silence or by the growing tension. "I'm protecting this neighborhood," she repeated, her voice unshaken, as though the entire community stood behind her. "And if you don't like it, maybe you shouldn't be here at all." The situation was spiraling out of control, and Marcus knew it. The longer this confrontation dragged on, the more impossible it seemed to resolve. He could feel the anger and frustration building inside him, but he was determined to keep his composure. He wasn't going to let this woman's prejudice define him, nor would he let it define the community he lived in. But the situation had escalated beyond a simple disagreement. The emotional toll was starting to show. Marcus realized that he wasn't just fighting to enter his home. He was fighting against an unspoken truth that had always lurked beneath the surface of the community, a truth that had now been exposed in the most painful way possible. As the tension reached a breaking point, the distant sound of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of the police. This moment would be crucial in determining how the situation would end, but for Marcus, it was already clear. This wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger, something that couldn't be ignored any longer. The tension in the air was suffocating as Marcus stood there, facing Mrs. Harris, who refused to let him pass. The sound of the distant sirens grew louder, but it was unclear whether they would even be able to solve this escalating situation. He could feel his patience thinning, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just an argument about whether or not he could enter his home anymore. It was something far deeper, a battle against a deeply rooted prejudice that had come to the surface. As the seconds ticked by, a figure stepped forward from the group of silent onlookers. It was Mrs. Jenkins, an older black woman who had lived in the neighborhood for over a decade. Marcus knew her well. She was someone who had always been friendly, But Marcus had never thought to engage her in much deeper conversation. He had always been focused on building his life, never thinking too much about the undercurrents of tension that might have existed in the community. "Marcus," Mrs. Jenkins called out, her voice strong and clear. She walked up to the front of the crowd and came to stand beside him. Her presence was reassuring in a way, like a lighthouse guiding him through the storm. Mrs. Harris shot Mrs. Jenkins a look of irritation, but the older woman didn't flinch. "I know what's going on here," Mrs. Jenkins said, her gaze steady as she turned toward Marcus. "And I think you deserve to know the truth." Marcus looked at Mrs. Jenkins, confusion mixed with curiosity in his eyes. "The truth?" he asked. Mrs. Jenkins nodded. "Yes. What's happening right now isn't an accident. Mrs. Harris here," she said, her voice raising just enough to make it clear that she was addressing the whole crowd, "has a history of this kind of behavior. She's been doing this for years." Marcus frowned, the weight of her words sinking in. "What do you mean? What history?" Mrs. Jenkins sighed deeply, shaking her head with a mixture of frustration and sadness. "She's made accusations like this toward other black residents in this neighborhood, always about them not belonging, always about them being in the wrong place. She's always got something to say when she sees a black person around here. She's quick to assume the worst." Marcus's stomach twisted as the realization hit him. This wasn't a one-time incident, a random misunderstanding. This was a pattern of discrimination, a recurring behavior that Mrs. Harris had been engaging in for years, and he had just become the latest target. Mrs. Harris, visibly flustered, shot back defensively. "That's a lie. I'm just concerned about the neighborhood," she exclaimed, but there was a tremor in her voice now. The calm facade was slipping, and the cracks in her story were beginning to show. Mrs. Jenkins, however, wasn't backing down. "Concerned? You've got a long history of making people feel like they don't belong here, just because of the color of their skin," she retorted, her voice unwavering. "You've done it with Marcus, and you've done it with others. You tried to get the police called on Mr. Williams a few months ago, just for walking down the street. You called the cops on Mrs. Andrews when she was simply sitting on her porch, reading a book. And don't even get me started on what you said about Mr. Thompson's kids the other day. This isn't about protecting the neighborhood. It's about your own prejudices, and everyone here knows it." The silence that followed Mrs. Jenkins's words was deafening. Marcus felt as though he were hearing her story for the first time. He had never considered that his interactions with Mrs. Harris might be part of something much larger. The realization hit him hard. He wasn't just being stopped from entering his house. He was being confronted with a deeply ingrained system of bias, a prejudice that had been allowed to fester within the very walls of the community he called home. Mrs. Harris's face had turned pale, and for a moment, she said nothing. She was caught in a lie, exposed for her discriminatory actions, and there was nowhere for her to hide. The neighbors who had been watching from their windows now shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, some glancing at each other with expressions of disbelief. The atmosphere had changed. What had started as a simple confrontation had now evolved into a revelation of the racial undercurrents that ran through the neighborhood like a hidden current, something that everyone had quietly accepted for far too long. For Marcus, the weight of this discovery was overwhelming. His thoughts were swirling, each one filled with a growing sense of anger and disillusionment. How many times had people in this neighborhood stayed silent when they witnessed this kind of behavior? How many times had they turned a blind eye to the prejudice that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface? He couldn't help but think of all the times he had tried to fit in, to be the good neighbor, to make his life here work. But now, standing in front of his own home, with Mrs. Harris's accusations hanging in the air, it was clear to him that he had never truly been accepted, not fully, not in the way he had hoped. Mrs. Harris, realizing she was losing ground, tried to defend herself once more. "I'm not a racist," she muttered, though the words seemed hollow, devoid of any real conviction. But Mrs. Jenkins wasn't having it. "You've shown your true colors now," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We all see who you really are, Mrs. Harris." You've been doing this for years, and it's time for it to stop." The crowd that had gathered began to shift, some of the neighbors now speaking up. They weren't necessarily supportive of Marcus, but they were no longer willing to stay silent in the face of Mrs. Harris's prejudice. The silence that had once kept this issue hidden was beginning to crack, and for Marcus, that was a small victory in itself. But the situation wasn't over yet. The sirens that had been growing louder now came to a halt, and the police finally arrived. The moment of truth had arrived. Would they back up Marcus, or would they side with the woman whose accusations were rooted in racial bias? Would this moment finally be the catalyst for change, or would it be another instance of injustice that would fade into the background, like so many others before it? As the police car came into view, Marcus took a deep breath. He had fought for his right to be in his own home, but now he was fighting for something far bigger: the future of his community and the chance to stand up against the systemic racial bias that had been quietly accepted for too long. This moment, he knew, could change everything. The silence that followed the arrival of the police was deafening. As the officers stepped out of their car and began to assess the situation, Marcus could feel the weight of what had just transpired. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding at his front door. It was about making a stand, showing the world that he wouldn't be silenced, that he wouldn't allow the prejudice of one person to define him or his place in this community. Marcus took a deep breath and stood tall, his body stiff with a mix of frustration and determination. He had fought back against Mrs. Harris's accusation, but he knew that the battle wasn't over yet. He wasn't about to let this incident be swept under the rug, dismissed as a moment of confusion or a mistake. This was bigger than just his right to enter his home. It was about holding people accountable for their actions, about challenging the racial biases that had been allowed to persist unchecked for far too long. He pulled out his phone and dialed the police. He wasn't calling to escalate things or cause trouble, but he knew that in order for this moment to be properly addressed, the authorities needed to be involved. As the phone rang, his mind raced. What if they didn't take him seriously? What if they sided with Mrs. Harris, with a woman whose accusations seemed so deeply rooted in prejudice? The fear lingered, but he pushed it aside. He was doing the right thing. The dispatcher answered, and Marcus quickly explained the situation. "I'm being harassed at my own home. I live here, but a neighbor, Mrs. Harris, is blocking me from entering. She's claiming I don't belong here, and she's been acting suspicious toward me ever since I moved in. I need someone to come and verify my identity." The dispatcher assured him that help was on the way, and Marcus hung up, feeling the weight of his decision. He knew that calling the police would bring attention to the situation, and though he hoped the officers would handle it fairly, he couldn't be sure what would happen next. The police arrived within minutes, 2 officers stepping out of their squad car and walking toward the group. Mrs. Harris, visibly agitated, immediately tried to explain her version of the story, but the officers listened carefully, taking note of her every word. Marcus, standing firm, handed the officers his ID and house keys. "This is my home," he said, his voice steady despite the tension. "I've lived here for years. I don't know why Mrs. Harris is making these accusations, but it's unacceptable." The officers nodded, examining the ID and confirming the information. After a few minutes of conversation and checking the records, they turned to Mrs. Harris. "Ma'am, this man has every right to be here. He's the homeowner. There's no basis for your claims." Mrs. Harris's face flushed with embarrassment as the truth hit her, and the crowd of neighbors that had gathered stood in stunned silence. She had been caught in a lie, and the truth was now laid bare. The officers told her that any further harassment could result in legal consequences, and with a final, pointed look, they left the scene. Marcus, though exhausted, felt a small sense of relief as the situation finally began to de-escalate. As the police car pulled away, Marcus stood in front of his home, a quiet anger still simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't sure what was worse: the fact that this had happened to him in the first place, or the realization that so many people in his community had quietly accepted this kind of behavior. Mrs. Harris's actions were an expression of a deeply ingrained prejudice, and Marcus now knew that he wasn't just fighting for his own rights. He was fighting for the dignity of everyone who had ever faced such discrimination. But the aftermath of the confrontation didn't end with the police. Word quickly spread throughout the neighborhood about what had happened. Some neighbors, including Mrs. Jenkins, had begun to rally around Marcus, offering their support and speaking out about the prejudice that had been exposed. Others, however, chose to defend Mrs. Harris, claiming that she was simply trying to protect the community and that Marcus was overreacting. The divide was palpable. As the days passed, Marcus found himself at the center of heated debates. Some residents reached out to him personally, apologizing for not intervening sooner, expressing their regret over the way things had unfolded. Others, however, seemed uncomfortable with the entire situation, unsure of how to address the uncomfortable truths it had unearthed. In the local Facebook groups, online debates began to flare up. Some neighbors supported Marcus, sharing their experiences with racial prejudice and advocating for stronger community bonds that embrace diversity. They posted comments, offering Marcus their apologies and insisting that Mrs. Harris's actions were not a reflection of the community as a whole. They expressed hope that the neighborhood could learn and grow from this painful incident, that it could become a place where everyone, regardless of race, could feel safe and welcome. However, there were others who defended Mrs. Harris, who insisted that Marcus was exaggerating the situation. They claimed that he was playing the race card and that Mrs. Harris was merely concerned for the safety of the neighborhood. Some even went as far as to suggest that Marcus should have been more patient, that the confrontation could have been avoided if he had just remained calm and allowed Mrs. Harris to ask questions. Their comments were filled with frustration and a refusal to acknowledge the deeper issues at play. The comments online mirrored the divisions that were now evident in the real world. Friends, neighbors, and even family members found themselves on opposite sides of the argument. Some voiced their anger at the lack of unity, at the unwillingness of some to acknowledge the very real racial prejudices that had been exposed. Others, however, insisted that the issue had been blown out of proportion, that Mrs. Harris's behavior was a momentary lapse in judgment. Marcus, in the face of all this division, remained focused on the bigger picture. He knew the situation was far from over. It had opened up a much-needed conversation about race, privilege, and discrimination in his community. But for now, he was determined to continue living his life with his head held high. He wouldn't let this incident define him, nor would he allow it to be forgotten. It was a call for change, a call for a community to confront its uncomfortable truths and work toward a more just and inclusive future. The aftermath of the confrontation left Marcus with more questions than answers, but it also left him with a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for equality and justice in his neighborhood had only just begun, and he was ready to lead that charge one step at a time. As the days passed, the aftermath of the confrontation began to ripple outward, and the consequences for Mrs. Harris were swift and severe. News outlets, both local and regional, began to pick up the story. The once quiet suburban street now found itself thrust into the spotlight, and the incident became the focal point of debates about race, privilege, and accountability. The local news covered the details of the event, focusing on how a black man was unjustly harassed in his own neighborhood. Interviews with Marcus, along with statements from neighbors who had witnessed the incident, helped shine a light on the prejudices that had been lurking beneath the surface. The media didn't just report the incident as a simple misunderstanding. It revealed a deeper, troubling reality of racial tensions and the challenges of living in a community where such biases had been normalized. As the story gained traction, it sparked an outpouring of support for Marcus, particularly from black residents in the area. They began to share their own personal experiences with discrimination at the hands of Mrs. Harris. Many of them had been quietly enduring the same type of behavior from her for years, but until now, they had kept their stories to themselves. Some spoke of being followed or watched when they entered their own homes. Others recalled how Mrs. Harris had made derogatory remarks about their families. The more people shared, the more it became clear that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a long-standing pattern of discriminatory behavior. In response to the growing backlash, A petition circulated among the community members calling for Mrs. Harris to be removed from any leadership roles within the neighborhood. People were demanding accountability, refusing to allow someone with such prejudiced views to hold any position of influence. The petition quickly gained signatures, and even some of Mrs. Harris's longtime supporters began to distance themselves from her. As the pressure mounted, Mrs. Harris's reputation took a devastating hit. Once seen as a respected member of the community, she now found herself on the defensive, struggling to maintain any semblance of respectability. Her public defense of her actions only fueled the fire. She appeared in interviews, attempting to explain that she had acted out of concern for the neighborhood's safety, but her explanations were met with scorn. Many saw her words as an attempt to justify her racial prejudice, and her insistence that she was just trying to protect the community only highlighted the deep flaws in her perspective. People weren't just angry at the confrontation. They were furious at the larger societal issues it represented, issues that were now impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Marcus, despite the initial shock of the confrontation, began to feel a sense of empowerment that he had never experienced before. Though the encounter had been emotionally taxing, it had sparked something within him, a resolve to stand firm against injustice, no matter how personal or painful it might be. As the news of the incident spread, Marcus began receiving messages from allies, neighbors who had never spoken out before, expressing their support and solidarity. They were taking a stand with him, sharing their own frustrations with the systemic racism they had witnessed or endured. For the first time in his life, Marcus realized that he wasn't alone in this fight. The outpouring of support was overwhelming. He received messages not only from black residents in the neighborhood, but also from white allies who recognized the injustice of what had happened and wanted to be part of the change. Many of these supporters reached out to Marcus personally, thanking him for speaking out and encouraging him to keep pushing for progress. Some even offered to help him organize community meetings to discuss how they could work together to address issues of racial inequality in their neighborhood. This unexpected support gave Marcus the strength to move forward. He began to see the incident not as a one-off event, but as a pivotal moment in a larger movement towards social justice. The conversation that had begun on his doorstep was now spreading throughout the community, sparking discussions in living rooms, at local coffee shops, and even on social media. People were talking openly about the deep-rooted issues of racism and privilege that had long been ignored, and the conversations weren't just about the incident itself. They were about how to create real, lasting change. One of the most encouraging developments came from the neighborhood's homeowners association. In the wake of the incident, members of the association reached out to Marcus to discuss how they could improve the community's approach to diversity and inclusion. They acknowledged that the neighborhood had a history of overlooking racial issues, and they expressed a desire to create a more inclusive environment moving forward. The association promised to review its policies and make necessary changes, including hosting workshops on racial sensitivity and encouraging more open dialogue among residents. While some were skeptical of their motivations, Marcus saw this as a step in the right direction. The push for change didn't stop there. In the days following the confrontation, Marcus took his message beyond the neighborhood, speaking to local advocacy groups and joining forums that addressed issues of racial justice. His story resonated with others who had faced similar situations, and he quickly became a voice for those who had been marginalized or silenced. His experience, though painful, had ignited a fire in him that would not be easily extinguished. Through all of this, Marcus found himself becoming more than just a victim of circumstance. He was becoming an advocate, a symbol of resilience, and a catalyst for change. The shock of what had happened at his front door had forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths, and Marcus was determined to see that those truths didn't fade away. He understood that the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. As for Mrs. Harris, the consequences of her actions were clear. Her reputation was in tatters, and the community had made it clear that such behavior would no longer be tolerated. Whether or not she would learn from this experience remained to be seen, but one thing was certain. The events of that fateful day would have far-reaching effects, not just for her, but for everyone in the neighborhood. The The story of Marcus's confrontation had become a symbol of the fight for racial justice, and it was a fight that would continue long after the media coverage had faded. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, Marcus found himself reflecting on the enormity of what had unfolded. What had started as a simple, unsettling incident at his front door had become something much bigger, a movement. A single act of prejudice, one that had shaken him to his core, had triggered a chain of events that no one could have predicted. He had never imagined that his moment of personal frustration would spark a conversation that would ripple through his community and, in turn, lead to a shift in the neighborhood's mindset. As he sat in his living room, looking out the window at the street that had once felt so familiar and safe, Marcus realized how much things had changed. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood, about the possibility of progress, and the hope for a better future. He had become more than just a victim of racial prejudice. He had become a voice for change, a symbol of resilience. The weight of this newfound role wasn't lost on him, but neither was the responsibility that came with it. For Marcus, this experience had solidified his sense of purpose. It had given him a renewed commitment to fighting for racial justice, not just in his own life, but for future generations. He no longer saw himself as just a homeowner living in a suburban neighborhood. He saw himself as an active participant in the larger fight for equality. He felt empowered, knowing that his actions, no matter how small, could contribute to the ongoing movement for change. The neighborhood, too, had been forever altered. As the weeks went by, members of the community began to take concrete steps toward addressing the issues that had been exposed. The Homeowners Association followed through on its promise to hold workshops on racial sensitivity and inclusion, bringing in speakers and experts to educate residents about the realities of racial bias. Conversations that had once been avoided or dismissed were now taking place openly, as neighbors began to acknowledge the systemic issues that had plagued their community for years. The work was far from over, but there was a palpable sense of hope in the air. People who had once remained silent were now speaking up, sharing their own stories of discrimination, and expressing their desire for a more inclusive and understanding environment. The neighborhood was beginning to realize that true change wouldn't come from ignoring these issues. It would come from confronting them head-on and working together to create a space where everyone felt valued, regardless of their race. As for Mrs. Harris, her role in the community had been irrevocably altered. She had become a symbol of what the community could no longer tolerate. While some still defended her, many others had distanced themselves from her, unable to reconcile her behavior with the values they hoped to uphold. Mrs. Harris had been forced to confront the consequences of her actions, but it was unclear whether she would ever truly understand the depth of the harm she had caused. Regardless of her future, however, the ripple effect of her actions would continue to shape the community for years to come. For Marcus, the legacy of this event would be something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he also knew that this moment of personal injustice had given birth to something much larger, something that could not be undone. The fight for racial justice was not just a personal battle. It was a collective effort, one that required the voices and actions of everyone in the community, working together to create change. As Marcus looked out at the quiet street once again, he understood that this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future. It was about creating a world where people didn't have to fight for their right to belong, where everyone, regardless of their race, could walk into their own home without fear or prejudice. And as he moved forward, he carried with him the strength of his community's support, the power of his own voice, and the knowledge that even in the face of adversity, change was possible. This was just the beginning, and Marcus, now more than ever, was ready to be a part of the movement that would shape the future of his neighborhood and beyond. The legacy of this moment would live on, reminding everyone that no matter how small the act, it had the potential to ignite change. The fight for racial justice, for equality, and for understanding was one that would continue to evolve, fueled by the strength of individuals like Marcus who were willing to stand up, speak out, and lead the way. Now that you've seen how one simple act of prejudice sparked a wave of change, it's time for all of us to reflect on our own communities. Change begins with each of us taking a stand against racial injustice, no matter how big or small the act. Just like Marcus, we all have the power to challenge the status quo and create spaces where everyone belongs. If you've been moved by Marcus's story, take a moment to consider how you can contribute to the fight for racial equality. Start by speaking out, supporting those who have been marginalized, and having those difficult conversations that will lead to real change. Together, we can build communities where prejudice is no longer tolerated, and every person's dignity is respected. Don't wait for change to come. Be the catalyst. Join the conversation. Stand up for what's right. And let's create a world where justice prevails for all. If you're inspired by this story, hit that like button. Subscribe for more powerful stories and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together, we can make a lasting difference. Share this video, spread awareness, and inspire others to take action